So I just wanted to talk a little bit about lethal deer control and the options in Maryland. First off, needed to dispel the self-regulation myth some folks may have heard in their career. If you want to really control deer and solve deer problems, you have to lethally do that. You have to kill them. Deer do not self-regulate at levels compatible with most humans, especially in suburban and urban environments. We've heard that from time to time. And hunting does not increase deer populations. We hear that a lot too as an argument sometimes. If you remove deer, the remaining deer will have more food, more energy. They're healthier. They will produce more offspring. But those offspring, that increase does not in any way offset the gain you get from removing the deer that you do. Contrary to what Jonathan said, it's actually, believe it or not, only about a half a fawn per adult doe that gets successfully recruited into the population, which is interesting. So, you know, some folks would have you believe that hunting, they all start with one, but then you start hunting and they all start like pumping out 3 fawns. That's not the case. You know, it may go from 0.5 to 0.55 or 0.5 to 0.6, but you know, it in no way compensates for what you're removing using hunting. And you don't have to go far to see that. Catoctin 10 years ago, Monocacy, Antietam, Patuxent Wildlife Research Center, NIST, NIH, the list goes on and on. County parks, you know, all of those areas were self-regulating at 200 deer per square mile, you know, without hunting or without lethal control. Versus all the private lands around them with lethal control that were regulated at 30, 40, you know, deer per square mile. So if you really want to control deer, you have to do it lethally. You know, and I showed you this before, but you know, lethal control is what resulted in this drop. Now we need a much more of a drop. Don't get me wrong, but you know, we wouldn't have done this without, you know, if we would have relied on self-regulation, we would be going up probably, not down. So just to put that out there. Lethal options, regulated hunting, so just good old regular fall and winter hunting. Managed hunts, which a lot of the counties use and our parks use and Eddie uses at WSSC. Organized archery hunts, which are kind of a form of a managed hunt in a way. Deer cooperator permits, which is sharpshooting. Again, some of the counties use those. And deer management permits or crop damage permits. When I think lethal options, they're the main ones that I think about. Regulated deer hunting is our go-to tool. We have 70,000 deer hunters a year, typically, roughly. It varies some. They spend 800,000 days a year in Maryland chasing deer. They harvest 75,000 plus deer a year, so about a 50% success rate, roughly. Overall, it's the most economical deer management technique, and overall, it's the most effective deer management technique from my perspective at a statewide scale. Go local, maybe not, but from my perspective, statewide, that's what works, and that's what we have to rely on. So this is the hunter harvest. We started hunting back in 1927 again, and we killed 5 bucks in Allegheny County that year. So yeah, we've come a long way. This is the buck harvest, the maroon, the yellows, the antlerless harvest. We have mandatory deer check-in in Maryland. We always have. So you know, these are hard numbers, minimum numbers. We know not everything's checked in, but you can see, you know, this reflects that exponential growth we talked about back in the 80s and 90s. You can see how we ramped up our antlerless harvest or female harvest, trying to bring that population down. That's reflected in this decreased buck kill. And you know, we still have a long way to go. Don't get me wrong, but we are #1 in the U.S. for antlerless harvest per square mile. No other state in the country. What's that? Yeah. So it's good in a way because it shows we're being responsive and we're very aggressive, but it's also bad in a way because it shows you what we're up against and how resilient our deer herd is. We pound them as hard as we can pound them, and they just keep on coming back. Check stations were created here when we had 5 deer checked in. You know what I mean? We stopped with check stations in 2004, and you can't, you know, really you couldn't even tell here where we made the change from check stations to electronic check-in. And then the economy crashed, and we had these spikes when the economy crashed because we had more people that wanted to hunt. But yeah, no, we have no data to suggest that there's any problem with our check-in system. And everybody and every other state has pretty much went that way as well. We hear that complaint all the time. There's no way we would ever go back to check stations, because back when we had check stations, they were saying, oh, well, you know, it's just hunters are passing the doe around and they're taking it from check station to so, you know, we can't win. We can't win. Yeah. So, you know, I mean, we're not. Yeah, we had when we stopped using check stations, we had one check station in all of Prince George's County because we couldn't find anybody else to be a check station. It wasn't working for the hunters. You know, I mean, so, and we get much better data. No comparison. Much better data with the system we've had since 2005. 13 years. Yeah. So, anyways, so yeah, we're number one in the country for antlerless harvest per square mile. Our harvest last year was 77,382. It wasn't 77,382, but we manage off the trends. Yeah, I mean, our data, I have 100% confidence in our data. So yeah, so number one, but you know, the take-home message here is you know, this year our hunters harvested 40,000 female deer. So those 40,000 female deer aren't going to give birth to 25,000 fawns here in a month, which would then continue that cycle on down the road. So you can't underestimate the value of hunting. And then on top of it, hunters are buying that license. We're getting that excise tax money, and it's funding all this stuff. So I mean, it is, you know, it's our go-to tool for a very good reason. We are very aggressive. So deer season comes in early September with archery, runs through January 31st or the 30th if it's a Sunday. We have a 35-plus deer bag limit in Region B. We try to keep our sideboards very wide. We don't try to hinder or slow down deer harvest. Very, very, very few hunters ever come close to those bag limits. Our average hunter kills 1.9 deer a year. So again, and we knew that going in. So, you know, we try to keep these sideboards wide for those hunters that do want to harvest more deer, that they can do so. For the Montgomery County folks, you know, there was some controversy this year. We went from an unlimited antlerless archery bag limit. We cut it back to 15. We took some flack for that. We had one hunter take 15 antlerless deer. Yeah, and that would have fixed Montgomery County's deer management issue. Anyway, so we are very, very liberal, very aggressive. Our seasons and bag limits are structured to encourage the harvest of female deer, and we are very liberal with our weaponry as well. Hunters, myself included, tend to be gadget people, so if we keep them interested with different tools, keep them in the woods, hopefully they're taking deer for us. So we allow, you know, modern muzzle loaders, crossbows, air rifles, etc., just as long as it's ethical and effective. And then Sunday hunting as well. Sunday hunting's controlled, you know, we get requests all the time with Sundays. Sunday hunting's legislatively controlled. We don't have the authority to just decide what Sundays are going to be huntable. That has to be given to us by the legislature, so that's why it's a hodgepodge across the different counties, which ones can Sunday hunt, which Sundays. We support any of those bills. We would love to have a statewide bill, but every time one comes up, it fails. David? Nope, not the statewide one. We added some. We added some in St. Mary's, we added some in Cecil, and we added some in Dorchester. So, yeah. But that's the way the model's been since 2003 when we first started with Sundays. Every year it's a little bit here, a little bit there. It's to the point where I can't even keep track. I have to open the hunting guide to figure out what Sundays are. It's really, I would love to have a statewide bill, but I don't know if we'll ever get there. We'll see. So hunting's very effective. It's also supported in the state. You know, it's only 2, maybe 3% of Marylanders that hunt. It's a very, very small proportion of the population that hunts. But that doesn't mean the other 98% are anti-hunting, just the opposite. You know, 67% of the general Maryland population supports hunting and recognize the value in hunting. So that's a good thing because that is our go-to tool. And then along those lines, 77% of the general population agree that deer should be hunted to maintain a healthy deer population. So that's good. So moving on from just our good old general deer hunting to managed hunts. So generally, highly regulated firearm deer hunting. Application only typically. Often there's shooter requirements, shooter qualification requirements so that they can prove that they're ethical and effective. Most often there's fixed stand locations with defined shooting directions, so they'll literally tell you, you got to be in this stand and you can only shoot from here to here. So set days and hours. Often the hunters are actually driven to and from the stand, and when they harvest a deer, oftentimes they drive out and pick the deer back up for the hunter. The hunter doesn't drag the deer out themselves. So this is pretty common on parks. Some of the watersheds like WSSC, Montgomery, PG, a lot of the counties, urban, suburban areas where you're close to people. Emphasis is on safety. Labor intensive and expensive. There's a lot of Ryans out there on the days those hunts are going on. And Ryan's not cheap. He makes a lot of money. So, so you add all that up. I mean, it can get expensive real quick. More emphasis on quantity versus quality. These guys are out there to kill deer for us. So they're not out there to sit in the stand, hopefully, and wait for a buck to walk by. So more emphasis is on quantity of deer removed versus quality. Don't want to down talk any of the hunts. I mean, they're still great hunts, but it's more focused on harvested deer. Pretty small number of deer. I think this is probably pretty close. It's hard to get a direct handle, but we're probably talking 1,000 to 2,000 deer a year that are taken on managed hunts. So significant number, but nothing like the 70,000 or so that are taken with our regular hunting season. Generally effective and publicly supported for the most part. A lot of our counties, our urban, suburban areas, they are fed up with deer. They recognize the value in these, and they do support them for the most part. Organized archery hunting. Oh, shoot, 5 minutes. I got to go quick. Limited access, but more independent than managed hunts. Approval only, often shooter qualification, fixed property locations, often set days and hours, popular with some public property. So, and most of the time, these will be organized archery groups, and a county will say, you have this parcel of land, managed deer forest, using archery. And they may have restrictions for antlerless only or whatever. Emphasis is still on safety, but also on discreetness, because you're in areas where maybe guns just aren't compatible, so archery equipment would be. Less labor intensive, effective in populated areas. Again, still looking more quantity versus quality. Probably less than 1,000 deer harvested annually. Generally effective and publicly supported. Sharpshooting, deer cooperator permits. This is the professional guys. They're tested and permitted by DNR. There's an annual permit fee. They have to have an operational plan submitted to us for any of the locations they're going to shoot. Generally limited to February and March, which was a big change, a huge change this year. They used to be year-round. They're restricted to February and March now, unless there's human safety issues. If they're using one of these on an airport or a test track or something, then they can shoot year-round. But otherwise, now they're generally limited to February and March. Used in densely populated area. Now there is some agricultural use of these permits as well. And the big carrot is the night shooting. If you want to shoot deer at night in Maryland, the only way you're going to do it is using one of these deer cooperator permits. Discreetness, safety, and professionalism is the emphasis. Effective in more populated areas. David, you asked this earlier. It generally has been 1,000 to 2,000 deer a year. We haven't seen a big increase in the use of these. Some of that could be the bar that we have set for it, but a lot of it I think is just, again, the money to do it. Generally effective and publicly supported, generally expensive. Probably $500 and up per deer. May get a little cheaper than that, but it's expensive. Crop damage permits, which can also be used for folks with a forest management plan, as Jonathan mentioned earlier. Alleviate deer damage to commercial agricultural crops. So when we give a crop damage permit, there has to be a farmer that's using these for production. 1,800 permits issued annually. So 1,800 different, say, farmers get these. They can harvest 20, 30, 40 deer on them. It just depends. So really, I mean, these would authorize potentially 30,000 plus deer that could be harvested under them. We typically harvest about 8,000 deer. They can be used 365 days a year, so the Sunday restrictions don't come into play for deer management permits. They can use them on all Sundays, but no night shooting. So again, that's where that sharpshooting permit is more attractive. And we have seen in recent years legislation that has allowed rifles to be used in counties where you typically can only use a shotgun. That's the harvest chart for crop damage. You can see we peaked back in the early 2000s above 13,000. This is where we got real liberal with our regular hunting seasons and bag limits. So we weaned a lot of farmers off of crop damage onto the regular hunting seasons and bag limits. So the crop damage kill dropped. But you can see it has crept back up now, and it's 8,000, 9,000 typically, something like that. So it's important. I mean, you know, it's a valuable tool to our farmers that do use that system. Contraceptives and sterilization, I don't have a lot here. Not ready for prime time. Started out with contraceptives and birth control back in the 90s. You have to catch every deer, administer the contraceptive. So the thought was, and then go back and re-catch the deer a year or two later, hoping that it worked in the meantime, and then re-administer the contraceptive again. So the thought was, well, if we're going to have these deer down and in our hands anyways, why not just sterilize them? So there's been a shift from contraceptives to sterilization. No different results, really. You know, we have 3 or 4 projects in Maryland that they do. None of them, in my personal opinion, have demonstrated, you know, an ability to really manage deer or control deer, especially not on any kind of a scale. NIST started back in the 90s with contraceptives, and they've changed their design over time. They are also now doing sterilization. They started with 200 deer per square mile, and I think they probably have 175 deer per square mile now, something like that. So they're putting a lot of work into it. And like I said, we could use a tool like this, don't get me wrong, but it's just not there yet. So cost numbers, it varies depending on what level of volunteerism they get, but again, it can be over $1,000 a deer. With volunteers, they're claiming $300 to $500 per deer, but and the cost isn't in the drug. Like for the immunocontraceptives, the cost isn't in the drugs. It's the labor and the manpower, and the same with the sterilization. It's the manpower of catching them. What's that? Yeah. So for the sterilization and contraceptive, up till this point, they focused on females. Like I said, you know, because there's always that, you know, male out there as a substitute. On Staten Island, some of you may have heard, New York is funding a huge project where they are actually giving vasectomies to males. They're going to try that and see if it works. Tony DiNicola with White Buffalo, he works in Maryland too. Tony's been around a long time, but he's actually trying vasectomies, and he was over $1,000 that he had given vasectomies to the last time I talked to him, but it may even be closer to $1,500 or $2,000 now. I don't know. Have you heard anything, Ryan? $1,500. So yeah, so we'll see where that goes down the road. So that's all I got on this one. Questions?